Hello and welcome to another episode of Lunch with PB&J. I'm Ben. That's my wife Joy.
It's me.
Right over there. And we are here doing a podcast that is all about the Bible. Our goal is to bring you books of the Bible, go through them verse by verse, make them applicable, understandable, relational. I don't know about relational. Relatable.
Relatable.
That's the word
to
I was
yourself.
looking for. Relatable.
Relationals, share it.
Yep. We want to have a good relationship with you guys, so it's relational. We want to hear from you. So that's why we're here, and hopefully you're here because you know that's what this is all about, and you want to learn more about the Bible. Mm-hmm. You want to learn how it applies to our lives, and so right now we are going through the book of Hebrews. I will say it again. I don't mean to sound rude, but if you have not listened to previous episodes going back to the beginning of Hebrews, we highly, highly encourage you to go back and start at the beginning. We will still be here when you get caught up, all right? We're just once a week, so even if you listen to a couple a week, you'll catch up to us in no time, all right? And we'll be here. And the reason for that is because this is why we're going through verse by verse, is because they are letters. They are books that are written, and they obviously make sense when you read them in order.
Right.
And so everything builds on what has already been said.
Right.
We reference back a lot to what has already been said. We look forward to what will be said next. And so it just makes sense that you do it in order. So all that to say, if you're just joining us in the Hebrews series, I'd encourage you to go back. I think it's just 4 or 5 episodes so far, maybe 5 or 6, possibly 7. No more than 8.
Maybe, I don't know.
All right. I got to say something, Joy.
What's that?
I need you to turn that heater off over there. Whew, I'm cooking. It was all comfortable until Joy got in my office, and then it got hot.
If I feel warm, then I know you're probably roasting.
All right.
And it's quieter.
It is quieter. Now you can hear us nice and clear. All right, so if you got Bibles opened up in front of you while you're listening, that's awesome. You can take some notes as you go. If you're just listening on the fly, that's cool too. We are in Hebrews chapter 5, beginning a new chapter today.
Right.
But it is a continuation, as all of it is, because of what I just said. It's a letter that was written, but it really does flow from chapter 4 to chapter 5 on the topic of Jesus as our great high priest. Kind of the only real recap you need at this point is just to remember that this letter is written to Jewish believers who are considering leaving the Christian faith to go back into the Jewish faith. And so the writer is just constantly pointing to Jesus and why he is the Messiah, why he is what they've been waiting for, and why he is better than everyone and everything. Right? And so at the end of chapter 4, the writer goes all in on identifying Jesus as our great high priest. We said last week in the Jewish faith, the high priest was the highest authority, the highest human authority, right? And now they are being reminded that Jesus is greater than even the high priest.
Right.
And that title or role of high priest was not something that just got thrown around to anyone who wanted it. All right. You couldn't just show up in the temple one day and go, hey, I want to be the high priest today. So for the writers claim that Jesus was the great high priest, in order for that claim to kind of carry weight, he had to establish the qualifications that Jesus had to carry this title, and that's what the beginning of chapter 5
it's
is all about.
almost like these few verses that start us out are almost like proof.
Yeah.
He's proving that, hey, Jesus meets all these requirements.
Right.
Yeah.
So the first few verses, I think 4 verses, is going to really kind of just reference what is the role of the high priest as they would be familiar with it. And then the next 6 verses, we're going to go to verse 10 today. The next 6 verses are going to talk about why Jesus is qualified to take on that role. And I'll say this, I don't have this in the notes, and I can't remember if we've said it yet as we've gone through Hebrews. Well, this is a letter addressed to Jewish believers. I have, in recent years, our church here, where we pastor in Bolton, there's a high Catholic population. A lot of people that are Italian and different descents like that grew up in the Catholic Church. And so a lot of people have kind of exited the Catholic Church and entered into our church. And as a result of that, they're kind of trying to find their way through, like, what are the differences and what is missing, what's missing. And for a lot of people, maybe you grew up in the Catholic faith, that there is such a strong emphasis on the priest and what the priest does and the role that the priest provides, that he is the mediator between us and God. If we have sin, we go to the priest to be absolved of our sin, and he gives us all those directions and all of those things that you're familiar with. I want to encourage you, if you are of Catholic background, to really take into account, though this is written again to Jewish believers, people that came out of the Jewish faith, I see remarkable similarities to Catholicism today, especially in this area of the attention put on the high priest. And to understand that when Jesus came, as we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, really, we stay on this topic, that Jesus is the great high priest, that he has taken on the role of the high priest, not only in the Jewish faith, but also I would say in the Catholic faith. And so even though Catholicism was started after Jesus came, there was a tension that shifted over more to the priest that still had to fulfill some of these roles. It's like it became this merge of Judaism and Christianity, and Catholicism was kind of somewhere in the middle there. And so hopefully you can just listen to this and hear where Jesus takes on that role of high priest for you as well.
But it goes back to like what you were talking about earlier, where the Bible is relatable. So it was obviously relatable to who he was writing to years ago, applies to that. But you take it into your own life, and it comes back to that. It's relatable who for people who are coming out of that background, or it's relatable.
Absolutely. So here we go. We'll start. I'm going to read the first 4 verses, and then we'll go from there. So every high priest is a man chosen to represent other people in their dealings with God. That's what a whole high priest role is. He presents their gifts to God and offers sacrifices for their sins, and he is able to deal gently with ignorant and wayward people because he himself is a subject to the same weaknesses. That is why he must offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as theirs. And no one can become a high priest simply because he wants such an honor. He must be called by God for this work, just as Aaron was. So Aaron was the first high priest to the nation of Israel, going all the way back to Moses and wandering in the wilderness when they built the temple and all of those things. Aaron was the first high priest chosen by God to fulfill that role. So the qualifications of a high priest are kind of put out here before us. He represents people in their dealings with God, and his main role was really to offer those sacrifices and those offerings to God as God required, and then to like deal gently with ignorant and wayward people. Ignorant doesn't mean stupid, of course. It just means people that didn't know better, right? And so this is his role. And these qualifications are pulled straight out of the Old Testament, kind of that foundation of the Jewish faith. And the first instruction was that the high priest would be chosen by God to represent people to God. And that's in Exodus 29, verse 9. Israel is instructed to set aside the Levites as those who would fulfill that role. We read it, that verse says, wrap the sashes around the waist of Aaron and his sons and put their special head coverings on them. Then the right to the priesthood will be theirs by law forever, and in this way you will ordain Aaron and his sons.
So I look at that first part, and again, what you're talking about is almost this clarification of, here's the role of a high priest, here's what it looks like, here's the requirements, here's the function, here's what he's going to do. And again, it's that thing of, even the way it's worded in the very beginning, it just says, it starts with the word every. So every high priest, this is what it's looked like, right? And so I think as we look and we just see, like, Jesus meets this requirement that's talked about for this explanation of every high priest looks like this. So again, I don't know why that word every just stood out to me, because it's showing that even though Jesus has become the great high priest and he's superior, it's still showing that he still meets all of these first requirements that were there. It says every high priest is a man chosen. So a man. even just the simplicity of that, of this is why Jesus had to come and be a mankind, you know? So Jesus became a man. He came to earth. So even just that, he was chosen. Just what you said, I like that too, of like Aaron was chosen in the Old Testament. But here, Jesus is very clarified that God chose Jesus. He chose him. And so that meets that requirement. It's not, again, what you're saying is it's not somebody that just says, okay, self-appointed or even appointed by the people.
Right.
Because let's be honest, we mess up who we vote in sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So this is God chosen.
Right.
And that's a requirement that had to be met. And then again, I like that somebody who understands, the way they word it is somebody able to deal gently with ignorant and wayward people. And that comes back to this understanding that Jesus understands our weaknesses. Now, the difference with Jesus is he was able to understand, but again, like we talked about last week, he didn't sin.
Right.
So there's that. He meets that requirement.
Right.
So I look at all those things, and we could look at this and read these verses and think, okay, why does this matter to me? Why does it matter to me that I understand the role of a high priest?
Yeah, and that's what I want to. I'm going to take a minute here, and I'm going to dive a little deeper into that role, because I do like just what you're saying. I think it's important that we understand what the office, I'm going to call it the office of high priest, what the position or office of high priest was, because that helps us understand what it is now.
Yeah, and how Jesus
fulfills that, right? So the high priest role was to serve as a mediator between God and man. And the reason for that was because of sin, right? So we know that in Genesis, when God created the earth, he created Adam and Eve. He was in perfect relationship with them. He walked with them every day. He didn't need a mediator because there was no sin. Yeah. Right? So if you never put those pieces together, there's the pieces for you. Sin hadn't yet occurred. Yeah. And so God the Father, walked with Adam and Eve every day. And then sin. And then they disobeyed God. And sin comes into their lives. Sin comes into this world. And the next day he shows up to walk with them. And they're gone. They're hiding. And then when he finds them, he realizes that sin has come, and everything shifts at that point. And now there can no longer be this. While there's still a relationship, God continues to provide. God continues to talk to them. God continues in relationship, and yet now there is distance. Now there is separation. Now there is a disconnect between them. Yeah. And so God begins to put those steps in order to rebuild and to redefine that. And so you fast forward a little bit and you get into the nation of Israel and God's chosen people. And now he's starting to put things in place again. And so he sets up the office of high priest so that there can be a mediator, because God's greatest desire is that there would be relationship between him and mankind again. Right. And so there's examples, and so you have to understand, because it is sin that separated humanity from God. This role of high priest, this role of mediator, we have to understand how important this role is. And for lack of a better way of explaining it, how highly regulated it was. I mean, there are some very strict rules about this, and there's examples throughout the Old Testament where certain men tried to take on the office, or not even the office. They didn't even want the title. They just wanted to do what was the high priest's job to do. Yeah. And it had horrible consequences. You read in 1 Samuel chapter 13, King Saul, there's a battle going on, and Saul is the king of Israel, and Samuel is the prophet and priest at that time. And it is his role to offer the sacrifices. It is his role to do all of those things. But Saul is waiting for Samuel to show up. Samuel's running a little late. Okay, he's running a little late, and they want to make some sacrifices because they're losing the battle. Yeah. At this point, they're losing the battle. Saul finally lets his impatience take over, and he just walks in and he offers the sacrifices to God. Yeah, which doesn't seem like a big deal, right? I mean, he's offering sacrifices. It wasn't his job. Yeah. He had not. There was literally a week-long process for the high priest to cleanse himself before he went and offered sacrifices to God. Saul's in the middle of a battle.
Yeah.
And he just gets tired of waiting for Samuel, so he goes in, makes the sacrifices himself, and as a result of that, Samuel shows up and goes, "Dude, what have you done? What were you thinking?" And as a result of it, the kingdom is taken away from Saul.
Yeah.
He loses
Is it
his
through
authority.
that decision that's how it all...
That's where it all begins to fall apart. That's where it all begins to unravel for Saul. In Numbers 16, they're wandering in the wilderness, and there's this guy named Korah, and he leads a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, who is the high priest at the time. And even though Korah was of the Levite tribe, so in other words, the Levites were the ones set aside to serve in the temple.
Right.
So he already had a position of serving God in the temple, but at this point, he is like a lot of people in Israel. He is annoyed with wandering in the desert. He's annoyed with Moses and with Aaron.
And he thinks he can do a better job.
He thinks he can do a better job, so he comes at them and challenges them and basically says, "I'm high priest, and I'm going to be the high priest now.
Wow.
I'm going to take over your position." And so Moses has he just freaks out for a second, all right? You can read about it in number 16. And he just kind of flips out and goes, "What are you thinking? No, you already have a position in the temple. Why do you want to take on this position that has not been given to you? It's been given to Aaron." But Korah says, "I can do a better job. There's a lot of people that think you guys are a failure, that you don't know what you're doing." And so it's fascinating. Moses issues them a challenge.
Wow.
He says, "Come back tomorrow. You bring your sacrifices, and Aaron will bring ours. And we will sacrifice. We will make offerings to God, and we will let God choose who the high priest is."
Wow.
Because he will only accept the offering. And so this is the story. If you're not sure what the context is, this is the story where they show up the next day. They agree to the challenge. They come back the next day. And Aaron and Moses fall on their face before God. They make an offering to God. God accepts it. And then Korah and his rebellious followers make their offering. The ground opens up, and it says they are swallowed into the grave alive.
Wow.
There's a process. And it is up to God to choose who the high priest is. It is not a position that's just out there for anyone. Aaron was the first high priest chosen by God from among them to minister for them.
Yeah.
The main role of the high priest did take place around the altar. It was to offer those sacrifices that were required by God. This is going to be talked about later on in Hebrews. We're going to talk about the whole point of the sacrificial system and what that was all about. So we'll talk about that then. And yet it was made very clear that unless the sacrifices were made in the right place by the right person, they would not be accepted by God. That was made abundantly clear. And so we'll just touch on it for a second, just so we understand where we are. The entire system, all right? And I know that maybe it sounds weird to say it that way, but the entire system was set up because of the separation that existed between God and man.
Right.
And so while God desperately wanted relationship, and while he desperately wanted to lead humanity, he couldn't do it while they were in this rebellious state. He couldn't do it while they were still in sin. And so he's put in place the high priest. And the high priest offered sacrifices for the sins of the people so that they could continue to be in relationship, continue to be led by him and guided by him. And so verse 2 and 3 explains that the high priest, being chosen from among the people, could be compassionate towards them.
Yeah.
In other words, he understood their struggles,
Right.
just what Joy was talking about. He understood their struggles. He would be a man that would deal gently with people because he recognized faults and failures. He recognized what it was to struggle in sin. In other words, the high priest would have the capacity to control his feelings towards people. All right? And what I mean by that is he wouldn't deal with people based on anger. He wouldn't deal with people based on, I don't like that person, so therefore, you know, I'm not going to offer their sacrifice.
Or even just like, how many sacrifices have they brought me so far? Oh my goodness, this is getting out of hand.
Oh, here comes Jedediah again, you know, back here offering the same sacrifice for the same sin. So this was the high priest. He was supposed to be compassionate, and that's what it talks about.
Right.
He wouldn't deal out of emotion of anger, contempt, sadness, or anything like that. He would hold sympathy from the self-awareness that he himself was a sinner.
Right.
That he was also imperfect, prone to sin, and that's why I said again, there was a week-long process that the high priest had to go through before he could go into the temple, and especially into the Holy of Holies, which represented where the presence of God was, where he would make those sacrifices. It was so incredibly important that he would be pure and holy in the sight of God. And I say all this. I know I'm talking a lot. I'm going to let Joy talk towards the end. She said she got bunched there. I really wanted us to understand this, because sometimes I feel like we look at the Old Testament and we just see nothing but legalism. Yeah. Right? That's our word for it today.
Or you even just like the story you just told about if you were just flipping through the Bible and decided to read the one where God swallows everybody up from the, Yeah. You would read that and not understand what just happened.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I want you to understand that we can't forget that the entire sacrificial system, the entire office and appointment of high priest, it was all set up by God and given very clear instructions by God as to why and how it should operate.
Right.
This was not like trial. There was not. It wasn't like Korah just said, "Well, I'm going to try to take over the office." No, it had been explained how this was going to work. And if you read that chapter I talked about in Numbers, Moses is like on his face begging Korah not to do it.
Yeah,
he's begging him not to go through with this. Yeah, and they just wouldn't listen. And it was all put in place because it made a way for us to come, for them to come into relationship with God, because God is holy, and we are instructed to be holy as He is holy.
You just look at what an act of rebellion that truly was, and how it would have messed up. Look at the people that it would have affected. Yeah. If he just said, "I'm taking over," and that's not the person God chose. Look at the people that would not have been made right with God.
Right. And again, the reason I'm pushing in on this a little bit is because I think what we can do sometimes is we can really want to embrace the new covenant, which we should. And we're going to, again, new covenant just means under Jesus. We are forgiven by Jesus. We don't have to offer sacrifices. You don't got to bring your goats to church. And I'm not going to kill any goats on the platform here at Connect. All right. And we'll talk more about the new covenant again as we go through Hebrews. But I think we can embrace the idea of Jesus as the sacrifice so much that we forget that God still expects us to pursue this level of holiness that's talked about in the Old Testament, right? We're still expected to live these pure lives, that if we have been given the opportunity because of Jesus to come to the Father on our own, but He still expects us to come with the same pursuit of holiness that was expected of the high priest at that time.
Well, and even as you were reading, and me taking that and relating it to myself today, because again, we can so much look at it in the filter of, well, I don't have to go to a high priest. I just come right to God. Again, if you don't understand what you just explained of what the role of the high priest was, we won't understand the role of Jesus in our lives today. And so it is that seriousness, I guess, too, of understanding, don't ever take God's job. Don't ever take Jesus' job. Don't ever take the high priest job. And I think we say, "Oh, well, I'm not doing that. I don't do that. I don't do that." But we do that every time we start to rely on ourselves. Every time we start to think, that we're in control. Every time that we start, yes, we have a access to God now and all that, and we have that. So I don't want to confuse that. But there's this, to me, understanding Jesus' role in our life, and it's only through Him. It's only through that high priest. So I think that's how you bring it into that story into relating to us. Of you can't be like this other guy who says, "Well, this is not happening fast enough. I'm going to take control."
And I think one of the ways that maybe we can relate that as you're talking, is how do we take over the role of high priest? Is what if it's like when we try to absolve ourselves of sin? You know, in other words, God is convicting, the Holy Spirit's convicting us of sin in our lives, and we're like, oh no, it's okay, I'm okay. You know, I'm fine.
Yeah.
You know, and instead of going to the great high priest of Jesus and being forgiven of that sin, we just do it in ourselves, and we're just like, you know what? I'm just going to move forward. I'm a good person.
Yeah.
And so therefore I forgive myself for those mistakes. Well, that's great. That makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside. That's awesome. But that doesn't do anything for the relationship between you and God, especially if you continue to walk in that sin. Right. And so this is why it's understanding, again, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the character of God never changes. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so it's not that the role of the high priest has been put away. It's that it has been taken over by Jesus. This is when Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it.
Yeah.
This is part of it.
Yeah.
Is he came and said, I didn't come to say that the role and the office of the high priest is useless anymore. I'm coming to say I am the high priest now.
You know what, kind of like in starting Hebrews and reading through all these chapters, what has been quite like come to the surface for me is this idea of, when I think of Jesus, I tend to only, like in the sense of his role and what he did on the cross and all that, I tend to lean more towards the thought pattern of him. Okay, he's the sacrifice, and he is, and we know that he's the perfect Lamb of God. So it's so interesting. I actually don't even know if Hebrews gets into any of that, him being the sacrifice as well. But it's this. I don't think I ever really thought much about he's the high priest. He's the one who offers the sacrifice, and he is the sacrifice.
Right.
And I think that's almost just mind-blowing, because I did understand a little bit more, or just, I don't know why I kind of thought more about Jesus being the sacrifice and the lamb, and it had to be holy and had to be pure, and this, because that's an Old Testament reference and understanding. But I didn't really think a lot about the high priest and the importance and the role. And so this is really bringing it to light for me of the importance of that aspect too, of that Jesus has in my life.
So one more little tidbit of high priest trivia for you that kind of sets up the rest of it, and why Jesus is now the great high priest, and why it was so needed as well, is verse 4 says again that no one, I'm going to paraphrase it, no one gets to just step up and say, I'm high priest now. All right. Korah tried it. Saul tried it. Took a lot of people down with them. All right. The high priest is an appointed position chosen by God himself. Now, the reason that's an important part to understand is because at the time that Hebrews was written, the Romans had begun to actually select the high priest for the Jews. So it was no longer the man that God chose, it was the man that Caesar chose. The Romans were choosing the high priest, and the reason for that is because they wanted someone that was devoted to the government more than God. In other words, they wanted somebody that they wanted a high priest that would keep the Jews in line. You know, that they wouldn't cause, because if you remember, at the time this is being done, the Jews are in oppression to the Roman government. And so rather than like letting history repeat itself, where, you know, Egypt had them in slavery and then all of a sudden the Jews started to outnumber them, and it became a dangerous thing. Like, they didn't want a repeat of history, because it seemed like every time somebody tried to oppress these Jews, they bounced back. And so they didn't want a rebellion on their hands. So they said, let us put somebody in a position over them. So then it looks like they still have control of themselves. But it's their way of controlling. But we're going to pick the guy. We're going to pick the guy that does that. And so the position had really become political more than spiritual.
But again, even that that man chosen thing instead of God chosen. Old Testament, God chose Aaron, and that was for a season where he chose the high priest. But then Jesus came. He's the high priest now. So you take what you're just saying and relate it to us today. This is why we do not need a high priest. This is why we don't need to go to a priest to confess our sins. And this is why that's not biblical. Right?
And this is why the religious leaders and the high priests at the time of Jesus were terrified of Jesus. Is because he was rocking the boat. He was coming in and saying, I'm going to be the king of the Jews. and they're like, oh, crap, he's going to get us in trouble with the Romans.
Yeah.
And so this is why they were terrified of Jesus.
Yeah.
Is it didn't have any, it had a lot to do with their own religious beliefs, but it also had a lot to do with political things that were going on as well. So there you go. Let's keep going. Verse 5. It says, that is why Christ did not honor himself. So because somebody just can't speak up and say, I'm high priest now. It says, that is why Christ did not honor himself by assuming he could become high priest. No, he was chosen by God, who said to him, you are my son. Today I have become your father. And in another passage, God said to him, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek.
That's hard to say.
It is. I had to pause just before I say it. So you got that?
I don't have anything on that. No,
Okay.
It's just it's more that recapping of it's God that chose Jesus.
Yeah. So just a couple little references there. Jesus, he's basically just saying Jesus didn't come on the scene and declare himself the high priest without a call of God on his life. He was sent. He was literally sent by the Father for this role.
Yeah.
That was why he came. And so the writer of Hebrews, what he does there's two references. One is from Psalm 2, verse 7. The other is Psalm 110, verse 4. And what the writer does is he combines those two passages together to show the call that Jesus had on his life to the position of high priest, but also to show that he wasn't just an ordinary high priest, but he was going to be a high priest from the order of Melchizedek. Yeah. Now, Melchizedek is introduced to us in Genesis, and he holds a very unique title of not only was he a high priest, but he was also a king. He was the king of Salem and a high priest. So he was a priest and king, or a king and priest. And he is talked about in greater detail. There's a lot of mystery that surrounds Melchizedek, and so we're going to do our best to explain it, but not today, all right? The reason for that is in Hebrews 7, so just a couple chapters from now, he's talked about quite a bit, his role, his background. We get a lot more information about him. So we're making a call, and we're going to talk about Melchizedek later on, but I just want you to understand this is the significance. So the order of priest, it was very specific. He was a very specific type of priest because he was not only a high priest, but he was also a king. And so again, when you think about this in terms of Jesus, Jesus is a high priest like Melchizedek. Jesus fulfills this dual role as well. Not only is he the great high priest, but he will be introduced to us as the King of Kings. All right? So Jesus will be the great high priest, but he will also be the king and will rule over all of creation. So he is now the great high priest who mediates for us, but he will become the King of Kings who will rule over all creation.
And I just want to add just a little bit of a little line there. So this is in chapter 7, verse, what is it? Verse 16, and it talks about him. But it says that by the power, Jesus became a priest not by meeting a physical requirement of belonging to the tribe of Levi. So Aaron was from that tribe. He says, so he meets this requirement, but by the power of the life that cannot be destroyed. And then it says, and the psalmist pointed out this by when he prophesied, you are priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So it keeps referencing back that line, you are a priest forever in the line of Melchizedek. And it's like, that stood out to me of, he's gonna meet the requirements by the power of a life that can't be destroyed. So I feel like, Ben will explain more in the future of the mystery of that Melchizedek. Yes, you will. I know you will, because we'll reference back. But just to understand the line of Melchizedek means, part of that is what it means is, he will never be destroyed.
Right.
There is no end to his reign. He will always be high priest. So I just want to clarify that. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. And so we go on. How does he fulfill this role? Verse 7, it says, while Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. I'm going to go verse 8 in a second, but do you have anything there?
Just keep going. And,
all right. I was just going to say this, then. I'll just make this comment. If a high priest is meant as part of their roles, if the high priest is meant to offer prayers for the people, then Jesus did that while he was here. This is one of the ways that he fulfilled that role.
Yeah.
In the same way that a priest would pray for people before offering their sacrifice for sin, it's thought here by most people believe that what the writer is referring to here is when Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane and with loud cries and with tears and such anguish and passion that he literally began to sweat blood. And when he did that, he was doing it before he was being offered as a sacrifice for the sins of man. And so in the same way the priest did it in the Old Testament, this is part of the way Jesus was beginning to fulfill his role as the great high priest.
Wow.
Verse 8, even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. In this way, God qualified him as a perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. And God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
We say that differently.
How do you say it?
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. Either way.
Melchizedek.
It's hard to say. Yeah, so I told Ben when I got here, I felt quite, I don't know, I felt quite moved by these last few chapters. It just kind of messed me up. And it's this idea for me that, I have many times either heard people say this before or even myself said, why did Jesus have to die? Why did Jesus have to suffer? Like, especially for those of us that, maybe don't know all of the Old Testament or know all of the sacrificial, process. And so for us, it's like, why? Why did it have to happen this way? And so just reading this, I feel like it really came to light for me, this understanding, Jesus didn't want to suffer. Jesus did not want to experience pain and agony.
Yeah.
It's not like that was easy for him. We see that in verse 7 here, where it says he offered the prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears. And just what Ben's, referencing, we see this when he did this in the Garden of Eden. That his prayer to God of, when it got personal, when it was him of saying, can this cup be taken from me? And then again, we know the end of that, he says, not my will, but yours be done. But it's this you just see that Jesus didn't want to suffer. That's not what he wanted to do. He didn't want to experience pain. But more than him not wanting to suffer, Jesus didn't want to disobey God. Jesus wanted to obey God. And it's not that he had been obedient. He was obedient from the moment he came. We know this because, his life, we see his life, but you look and see everything he said. I don't say anything unless the Father tells me to say it. I don't go anywhere unless the Father tells me to go. So you see this life of obedience that he had from the beginning. But then you read this next part here, and in verse 8, when it says, even though Jesus was God's son. So I look at that and I'm saying, you see, even though Jesus was divine, even though Jesus was God, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. So it's this thing where Jesus didn't want to suffer. He could have called down all these angels come rescue him, but more than that, he wanted obedience in his life, so he chose that. And then it says he learned obedience, and I think I don't know, that's a fascinating phrase to me, the fact that Jesus learned obedience, because again, he had been obedient. It wasn't that he wasn't obedient, but then here in every translation said learned obedience. Like I just went through and, does every translation say that exactly that way? He learned obedience. And again, you go back to, I think it would be easy to look at it and say, well, he's God. Couldn't he just snap his fingers and be obedient? Like, didn't he already have obedience? I don't know. Sometimes we look at it and we're like, it's so easy because he's God.
Well, and I think it's such a crucial point because it's understanding that obedience is a choice.
Yes.
And so Jesus chose obedience even in the face of suffering.
Of death and suffering.
Yeah.
And so you see this, he had been obedient and now he's learning more obedience. But how? How is he learning more obedience? And then, it keeps going from the things he suffered. And I got so messed up by this today because it's this thought of, this is why he had to die. This is why he had to suffer, is because he's my representative.
Yeah.
And have you guys ever heard the phrase, how does it say? Suffering is a part of the human condition. Have you ever heard that? People use that phrase. I looked it up, and like Billy Graham quoted it at one point, but I don't know if he's the first one that came up with it. But it's this idea of suffering is a part of the human condition. And so I feel like you could even answer, why did Jesus have to suffer? Why did he have to die? Because he's my representative to God. He had to understand my weaknesses. He had to take my place. He's not only my representative, he was the sacrifice. So it's this thing of, why did he have to suffer? Because the human condition is suffering.
Yeah.
And you go back to that, the learned obedience. I felt like it was the human part of Jesus that had to learn the obedience through suffering. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Like, it was the human side of God. Because there's these things that we see, like this is the divine side of Jesus. But when you look at the human side of Jesus, it was him having to learn the obedience and lay down his life and do it, And yeah, I don't know. It just hit me real hard today, this idea of that's why he had to suffer, because he represents me. And when you look at that high priest role, and this is like, it just answered for me of, this is why he had to suffer. This is why he had to die. And it makes it clear to me. Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to what it talks about at the end of chapter 4 of, we have a great high priest that understands. He sympathizes with us.
Yeah.
And this is why he had to learn, that even in that obedience, sometimes obedience causes suffering, and sometimes we learn even greater obedience in our suffering, and I think that's just, it's part of the human experience, and that was why Jesus had to go through it. And so, sometimes I think it's interesting because sometimes, and I kind of used an example of this last week, but sometimes we think that we can't sympathize with somebody unless we've been where they've been, and so sometimes even as Christians, we feel like, well, I can't witness to this person because I've never been where they've been. Sometimes the greatest witness we can have is not to go where they've gone, but to say in obedience to Christ, yes, there are sufferings. Yes, life is not perfect. But what I have found is that when I continue to be obedient to Christ and to God's word, there are greater things. Relationship with God is greater than anything else that we'll ever experience and ever know. And that was really what Jesus learned, is I'm going to be obedient to the Father even through my suffering. And so in that, I'm going to learn, where it would have been easier for Jesus to just walk away from the whole thing and just go, you know what? Things are getting a little too hot down here. I'm just going to, maybe I'll just start to cut some corners, or maybe I'll just do this, maybe I'll do that, maybe I'll take an easier road. But he continued to choose obedience. Because
I don't know if anybody does this but me, but it's this thing of, we look at God and we say, God, you could have just snapped your fingers and made it this way or that way. And yet, again, you go back to all the structure that he had put in place earlier of how it was. And this is why it was so important for Jesus to actually learn it through our eyes, learn it through our shoes, learn it through being human, and actually suffering, instead of God just being up there and saying, okay, well, I'm just going to fix all this. My goodness, he could have just wiped us all out and started over again. But he chose to walk in our shoes and do it our way, in the sense of humanity, come down to humanity, because of the high priest.
And there's going to be a verse that comes up in Hebrews that I just really hit me a few months ago, and it talks about the fact that Jesus, having already experienced heaven, and what he was able, and it was like that was what drove him to continue to obey and continue to overcome the sufferings of this world. And I think it's what makes him the perfect high priest as well, is because he experienced suffering, but he had also experienced perfect union with the Father.
Right.
And it's that perfect union with God that drove him to continue to be obedient, and to be able to do that. So he is the perfect high priest to lead us through our temptations, to lead us through our sufferings, to lead us through our struggles with, what do I choose? Which way do I go?
Yeah.
You know? And I think what we can do sometimes is we can often put like church leaders and pastors kind of up on this pedestal, and we want them to live this and display this perfect life, and that can actually cause a lot of pastors and leaders to fall because they feel all this pressure and weight because they feel like everybody's watching them and needing them to be perfect. I will freely admit that I am not perfect, okay? But so we see that happen, but because Jesus, as our perfect high priest, he is the only one who is truly qualified to show us what a holy life looks like.
Yeah.
And this is why, and I just kind of end with this is why we have to get our eyes off of people. There is no pastor, there is no priest, there is no spiritual leader, there is no, great YouTube street evangelist or whatever. There is no spiritual leader that can do what Jesus did. Right? There is no one.
And this is what the writer of Hebrews is telling them so far. It's not about the angels. It's not about Moses. It's not about the high priest in the Old Testament.
And this is why it is. It's why we have to put our eyes on Jesus and on the life that he lived.
Yeah.
Because he lived a perfect and holy life. And that is still what is required of us. Nothing has changed from the Old Testament to the New. But now we have this great high priest. And so it goes on and says, because he is all of those things, it is why he is the only one qualified to offer eternal life.
Right.
He's the only one. As a pastor, I can't offer it to anybody.
Yeah.
Right? I can come and I can pray with you, but all I can do is point you to Jesus. Right. I can't absolve you of your sins. Right? Just because you go sit in a little box and tell some guy what you did wrong and he says, bless you, you're forgiven or whatever. I've never been in the box. I don't know what they say, but he can't. There's no priest on this earth that can absolve you of your sins. Jesus is the only high priest qualified to do it. Yeah. He's the only one. And neither can we, like in terms of us taking on the role of priest ourselves.
Right.
You cannot do it.
Right.
No amount of your good actions or good intentions. Jesus is the only one qualified to be the source of eternal life for all who choose to obey him.
And I love how it says, so God qualified him as perfect. He's the perfect priest. Why? He's a perfect priest and the source of eternal salvation. You even look at the Old Testament of when they were being, how do I word this? Like when they had atonement for their sin, guess what? They had to the next year go back and do, that big day of atonement again. Like there was a constant having to go back. And you know what? Aaron died. They put his body in the ground. He died. And the priest after that died. And the priest after that died. But like you keep reading it and it says, God designated him to be the high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And that goes back to that part of that mystery there is that this was from a line of a priest and king who would never be destroyed. Yeah. And that's that connection that we have with Jesus now is what makes him perfect, because this sacrifice was once and for all, and this sacrifice, he would be priest forever. So I think that makes it just understanding this is what makes him perfect.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And so we kind of summarize it with this of just saying, whatever you're suffering from, Jesus, our great high priest, sympathizes with you. He understands. He extends an offer of mercy and grace, which is needed to endure through the suffering. Right. And I would just say, if you are lost, if you feel like you are lost in your sin today, then he also extends an offer of forgiveness and salvation, and he is the only one qualified to do that. Right. And so if you are listening to other things and other people and they're trying to offer it to you, it is not only is it not true salvation, it is definitely not eternal. Right. In other words, it may make you feel good for a while, but it is not eternal. It is not lasting. What Jesus offers as the great high priest is eternal. It is salvation. It is relationship with the Father, and he is the one and only great high priest.
I really do feel like I've learned so much more about.
It's a fascinating book.
Yeah.
It really is. It's so good. So hopefully you guys feel the same way as we do. And we thank you for listening. Thank you for watching wherever you are. In fact, if you have gotten something out of this, if you've learned something, we'd love to hear what it is. If there was a point that stood out to you, we'd love to know what it was. If you have any questions about anything, of course, keep listening, keep watching. I really believe a lot of the Hebrews especially just keeps building on the same points over and over. And so a lot of what we've talked about is going to get explained even deeper as we go forward. So just keep listening. But if you have any questions, let us know. You can direct message us, leave us a comment. But we'd love for you to share the podcast with somebody that you know, somebody else that just needs to learn, needs to hear, and maybe somebody that you've talked to and just like, man, I would love to understand the Bible more. That's what we're here for. That's our heart. That's why we do it. So thank you so much, as always, for being with us, joining us, supporting us. And we look forward to meeting you next week for lunch right here, Lunch with PB&J.
Bye, guys.